as the neoliberal policies have been enacted over the past 30 years, and remember, these are matters of policy, not of economic law. Since the 1970s, neoliberal period, they've expanded enormously. On the eve of the 2008 crisis, for which they were largely responsible, they had about 40% of corporate profits. These are mostly predatory institutions. They don't contribute much to the economy. In fact, they may harm it. And they live on a huge government subsidy.
In fact, since the 1970s, in Britain and the United States and other rich countries that adopted the neoliberal agenda, growth has actually been slower than it was beforehand. That's partly due to big changes in the economy overall, but it does show that the idea that just cutting taxes, just limiting the size of government, just taking away protections that workers once enjoyed doesn't guarantee that you're going to see a prosperous society. What it does seem to guarantee is that you're going to see a more unequal society.
It produced a lot of damage. I think everybody knows it produced a lot of damage. Even IMF, even Mrs. Lagarde, the director of the IMF, even she says Washington Consensus, the New York is dead. Okay? So I don't think that capitalism in this sense won. No, I think that this experiment, sort of the second capitalist revolution, because that's what it really was, free capitalism from democracy, I think it failed.
We know that you need to have economic freedom to have political freedom. And in that sense, markets and democracies go together. But on the other hand, markets create vast amounts of inequality. And democracies are based on the idea that every person should have the equal potential to influence what government does. It's based on the idea of one person, one vote. And there's a conflict between those two things.
Well, so if you look at the countries in which you have both capitalism and democracy, there have always been two possible sources of tension. There are those, especially more conservative people, who worry that democracy will swallow capitalism. Those who do not have very much will use democracy to vote themselves more. So that's one concern that can happen. The opposite concern, and it tends to be people on the political left who worry about this more, is that capitalism will swallow democracy. That because some people have much more wealth and economic power, that they will use that to essentially take over the political system.
Well, as I said, I think a government should guarantee as much as possible competition. Competition meaning allowing entrants to be able to enter in the market. Capitalism should be very closely connected to competition, and democracy should be closely connected to competition. I think that the key connection between the two is competition between people and in the industries and enterprises and entrepreneurs. And when you lose competition, then you have monopolies, which also then affect politics.
Markets allocate things and distribute incomes, but governments can say, no, I'm going to take this money from you and give it to somebody else. So they can also allocate, yes? Or the governments can say, we're going to build bridges and not, amusement parks. So they can also take these decisions. That's why these two systems are often in conflict. And they're in particular in conflict about distribution of income. Because again, if democracy really worked well, would redistribute much more income. We would have much more equality than we have.
Bill Gates has made what I think most people would think are some really fine decisions about how to spend his money, but those are decisions that he made. Those are not decisions that were made by society. Those were not decisions that were made by the rule of the majority. So another issue is that of democratic control of wealth, which is that who gets to decide about how money is spent? Should it be the people themselves who make the money, or should citizens have some role in that process? So the issue here is really when you have a growing inequality, when you have growing concentrations of wealth, if you want to deal with that in some way, if you feel that that's problematic and unfair, then how and under what kinds of conditions should those kinds of disparities be dealt with? And so taxation is one way to do that in a general sense that at least indirectly is democratic.
Wenn die Bürger Steuer zahlen und erkennen nicht, dass der Staat mit diesem Steuergeld Maßnahmen macht, die den Bürgern auch nützen, zum Beispiel sehr gute Schulen baut, eine gute öffentliche Infrastruktur und Ähnliches, dann haben sie ein Misstrauen und sagen, das Geld wollen wir dafür nicht geben. Aber in Ländern, wo klar ist, dass der Staat im Interesse der Bürger gute öffentliche Güter schafft, wird dieses Misstrauen geringer oder abgebaut.
Government is a tool, and it's a tool that embodies this democratic idea that we should be governing ourselves. If we think of government as some distant and horrible overseer who tells us what to do without paying any attention to what we want, then yes, we think that government is at odds with a good market or a strong society. But if we see it, as we should, I think, as a vehicle by which we can achieve the goals that we can't achieve on our own, then we can and should be much more accepting of a strong government role that helps support a strong and innovative market. The real challenge is getting people to see it that way. And that is really the paradox that's raised by rising inequality, because government has played an important role in the United States and in some other countries in exacerbating inequality.
Oftentimes people want a lot of things from the government, but they don't really want to pay from them. And when there's a discrepancy between what people think they're giving to the government and what they think the government gives back to them, then you get a sort of lack of faith in the government, a lack of trust in political institutions, and a sort of disillusionment with democracy. But there's a sort of discrepancy between what people want and what they think their government is giving them, and that really does erode trust in government and in democracy overall.
So naturally, the whole neoliberal assault on the public has led to a decline in democracy and trust in government, trust in institutions, in general, it's social dissolution. Actually, it's even worse in Europe, but where the austerity policies are a kind of a sledgehammer undermining the economy and the society.
People often talk about it as if government, that you either have freedom or you have the government coercing you. And most people want freedom. Right? So if you frame it that way as sort of government versus freedom or government versus the market, then that's a conversation in which many people are going to say they don't want government. But it's not actually the kind of conversation that we need to have, because you need a lot of government for people to have freedom.
Well, I think that Americans and citizens of other rich democracies are hungering for a return to a stronger democracy. But they're also incredibly cynical about politics and about politicians. In the United States, trust in government has plummeted since the 1960s. What's happening in Europe right now is a massive loss of faith in the political elite. And it's understandable, because in many cases the political elite haven't responded to the economic insecurity that many citizens are facing, or to the rising inequality that leaves many people feeling like they're left out of the dream of prosperity. So The shift that we've seen over the last generation, I think, has been away from seeing wealth as a creation of society as a whole. In fact, Margaret Thatcher famously said, there is no such thing as society.
In the United States, we've forgotten why you need government, right? And how we got rich. We got rich with a lot of government and with a mixed economy. And so right now in the United States, the ideas of neoliberalism are dominant, even among people who think of themselves as being liberal or progressive or on the left. They celebrate the individual and they understand all the good that markets do, and they don't understand why you need a lot of government.
They don't offer an alternative to the system. They simply offer possibility to manage a bit more humanely, so to speak, neoliberal globalization. For instance, they are going to say, well, we are doing a little bit more of redistribution than the party of the center-right. But basically, there is a fundamental agreement between center-right and center-left on the fact that there is no alternative to this society. And the consequences of that is that when the profound phenomenon of depoliticization, when a citizen feel that it does not make any difference, if they vote for center-right or center-left, that in the end those are going to do the same kind of policies, well, they really lose interest in politics, because in order to be interested in politics, you must feel that your voice is going to make a difference. Usually when there is a vote in Western societies, when there is a vote between center-right and center-left, it is like if you are going to be able to give a vote between Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola.
The respect in which democracy isn't working well now is, very specifically political. If you're going to understand it, you need to think about the way its politics work, not about the way in which everyday life is structured and people's experience changes over time. Community has become a much less compelling picture of what life is like for people, because their lives are much more individuated, they're much more independently shaped, and they're much less dependent on extended social relations. So people live, they live in narrower and narrower personal spaces.
We've also stopped seeing ourselves as deeply tied to others as we once did. I know that that after World War II, that Americans felt like they were connected by the bond of shared conflict. And indeed, Europe emerged from the ashes of the World War with a strong sense of solidarity. And that solidarity was embodied in a common project of building prosperity. So what is it going to take to create that sense of common purpose today? We don't want to have a world war every time we get concerned about inequality. We don't want to have a depression every time we want to respond to insecurity. We want to figure out reservoirs of support for addressing inequality within our own societies.
That when you have a government that gets more and more power, as I think government does need a lot of power in order to regulate the market and to counteract corporations, as that happens, you get a larger bureaucracy, which means a larger number of people who are not themselves directly elected, but who run things really in the back rooms. So how are you to guard against those people gaining a sort of undemocratic power?
Finally, democracy and bureaucracy are opposites. You cannot have a robust democracy and powerful bureaucracies. Because let me tell you, bureaucracies have a view of the world which is totally antithetical to democracy. Bureaucracies have a hierarchical view of the world. It's a pyramid.
You choose a government, but then the government has to govern. And citizens obviously often don't like the way the government governs. Citizens can organize in protest against government policies. Yes. And they can organize in other forms of trying to influence government decisions. But their role, they don't have that much to do between elections. Part of the problem that we have in the design of democratic institutions is that we don't have institutions that allow citizens to control government bureaucracies that provide services to them.
What I would say, basically, in answer to that, is not really that the bureaucracy is particularly enlarging. What is, and I don't think bureaucracy is a sort of political enemy of democracy. I think that's a mistake, really. What I think is very bad for democracy is inequality and the economic circumstances of most people's lives. The inequality is bad because it weakens people politically, it weakens most people politically.
In which we asked government officials here in Washington what they thought about the people. And we were very disturbed by the answer. First, they didn't know much about the people. Second, they thought the people were quite foolish. Their idea was that ordinary people should just be quiet and do what they're told. Now, these were bureaucrats. They're not elected officials. But bureaucrats in the United States and in Korea exercise enormous power.